gonna save our city. Who knows who he could be the one? Everybody's got the lowdown on your town. I'm here today at the editorial offices of Random Lengths News to interview Michael Nelson Feuer, who is an American politician and lawyer. He is a graduate of the Harvard Law School. He has previously been a assembly member for the 42nd District. And some of you may recall that he was actually a city council person between 1995 and 2001 for the 5th District. Prior to this, he was the director of Tezdek Legal Services.
That's
Yeah, okay. And a lawyer in private practice. He is now running for mayor of Los Angeles in the 2022 election. And he says, "I'm running for mayor to bring strong, proven, effective, and experienced leadership to a city facing tough challenges." It's my pleasure to introduce our readers to Michael Feuer, the current city attorney for the city of Los Angeles. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, James. That was great. And by the way, just for those who are watching this or the readers, I was kidding you a little bit about the pronunciation of Betzedek. They should know that Betzedek means House of Justice. It's a program that provides free legal work to the most vulnerable people in Los Angeles, principally senior citizens and people with disabilities who are about to lose their house or their health care, and they don't have a nickel to spend on a lawyer. So they turn to our organization. And I mention this only because it reflects my values. I was proud to lead that organization and help 50,000 people here in Los Angeles over 8 years, confronting the most difficult challenge they ever faced. And they needed us to stand up for them. And I think at this moment in the country and here in Los Angeles, that voters are eager for leaders whose values aren't expressed only in words, but in actions. So I just had to say that because I'm so proud of the work we did there. It really kicked off my career. Even though it wasn't elective office, it was very much public service. So thanks for the digression, but you happen to allow me to do that. So thank you.
It's a digression that leads us into the issue of homelessness. And what is currently going to happen is that there's going to be a lot of mass evictions of people who are going to need the services of that organization.
That's right. Yeah, I as city attorney have been very active in trying to prevent those evictions from happening. Our office wrote the eviction moratorium law here in Los Angeles. It is our office that has so far successfully defended that ordinance in federal court. We're back again because there are those who are challenging it now. I will say, James, that back at the beginning of the pandemic, I called a key congressional representative from our area to say, look, and this was back like a year and a half ago almost, the pandemic was not the fault of a landlord, or a tenant. Both are victimized by this when the tenant is thrown out of work because of COVID. And the federal government needs to step up and provide aid that tenants can use to make their landlords whole, so that everyone benefits. And of course, that conversation was very important to have. And of course, that is what the federal government has done. The aid that we talked about has been too slow in coming to the streets of Los Angeles, to tenants who desperately need it and landlords who would rely on it. You're right that there will come a point at which the city's eviction moratorium expires. That hasn't happened yet. The federal eviction moratorium expired. The state's is expiring, but the city's still has room in it. But the key is not that everyone just wait for the moratorium to end in Los Angeles. People need to apply for and get the aid that makes everybody whole again. if there clearly will be some additional evictions. And what does that mean for homelessness in Los Angeles? Just for our readers, right now, just to review where we stand, there are 41,000 people experiencing homelessness in the city of Los Angeles. About 28,000 plus on a given night have no place to go. So that's the magnitude of our current problem. And as mayor, I have a specific vision of what the city should be doing. And as our readers compare candidates for mayor, I hope they will compare the specificity of proposals and not rely merely on slogans.
Yeah.
So let me just be very precise. James, I'm mayor my first day. I declare a state of emergency on homelessness. It gives the mayor additional executive authority, and it also sends a signal to the public about the seriousness with which we're going to take this crisis. Next thing is I have to consolidate all the power that the executive has, and it is substantial in the city of Los Angeles. The mayor controls every city department. I need to consolidate that authority under one accountable official to be sure that we're doing everything we can. I wrote a piece, James, maybe 4 years ago almost now, for the LA Times that was very controversial. And the piece said, if we had an earthquake or similar natural disaster, there would be a FEMA field general here on the ground in Los Angeles. They'd be accountable with timeframes and measures of success. And if they weren't cutting it, they'd be gone because we'd have to recover. I wrote that we have the equivalent of that natural disaster now, and it's homelessness, and no one's in charge.
So tell me this.
Yeah.
Tell me this. Mayor Garcetti has said similar things about this being a crisis and an emergency. The governor of the state of California has called this a state of emergency. And yet I find over and over again, it's very difficult to get the various agencies of the city of Los Angeles to come on with an all hands on deck approach, you know, even to the extent of the harbor department, who is like one of the largest, controls the largest amount of land, I think, in the city outside of the Department of Water and Power, to review their vacant spaces for the use of temporary shelters, tiny homes, and we've got nothing but pushback from the department, from the harbor department.
Yeah. So James, a couple thoughts. First of all, in general, I share your view. One of my top objectives as mayor right away is to get everybody working toward the same goals. And if they can't do it, they won't keep their jobs. The general managers of the city serve the discretion of the mayor.
Right.
To give you an example, and then I'll get back to the harbor. Give me an example. I would create a strike team of the leaders at Water and Power, and engineering, planning, housing, all the departments that have something to say about the citing of approval of housing for people experiencing homelessness and affordable housing. And I would say, we are going to cut the time within which this gets accomplished. And if we don't, you will not have a job. And it's not because I want to be, tough about it in a mean way. It's because if we have an emergency, we have to act like it. There are lives on the line on the streets of the city. That means there should be jobs on the line in City Hall. Right. And that is how I will run the city as mayor. Now, parenthetically, when the harbor issue is complicated and it's going to be too detailed to get into right now, one of the challenges of using port property is there are various restrictions on how that can be used that pertain to state and federal law. And those restrictions may inhibit the city from being able to use some property there for this purpose. But my goal as mayor is to scour every opportunity that we can look at, because we are going to have to create more places for people to live. Now, I have been, James, as you know, a champion for saying building ground up is very expensive and time consuming. Several years ago, before Project Room Key, before Project Home Key, which involved hotels and motels, I advocated that the city take advantage of the existing infrastructure that is motels and get them converted into housing for people experiencing homelessness. And I was the leader of getting that to happen in City Hall. I then held town hall meetings. This is back again several years ago, before the most recent emergencies, of owners of those motels to encourage them to participate with us in this process. I said to them, look, I can guarantee you 100% occupancy because right now, even with a booming economy, that's not what you're experiencing. So I'm a fan of that kind of approach, taking advantage of moving things in 2 words, cheaper and faster. That's what an emergency requires.
That would be the ideal situation. What the city has done is to take the most expensive approach, which is to throw hundreds of millions of dollars at building permanent housing that will take years and years and years to build, and probably will not even suffice for the number of units that need to be built, while the homeless languish in camps on the sides of our streets. And I've argued with our current city councilman who is running against you, Mr. Buscaino, regarding the whole process by which he's addressing the homeless crisis. You may recall that 6 years ago, when he first got into office, there was a dust up down here in CD 15 that I played an interesting role in starting over the creation of tiny homes. And that exploded. And only just this year, as Mr. Buscaino embraced tiny homes as part of the solution.
Yeah, and James, you know what? Let's look again at how I will lead as mayor. Tiny homes. Tiny homes can be a part of the solution here, but we have still not been innovative enough about that idea. For example, 3D printing can build tiny homes much cheaper and faster. And one of the goals I have as mayor is to be the innovator when it comes to taking action on ideas like this and taking things to the next level of innovation. So I literally right now, as I have a team exploring how we can take advantage of 3D printing as it pertains to tiny homes to move like this. Because that's, James, I got to say, I wrote a piece for another newspaper recently that discussed a lot of the false choices that underlie our debate about homelessness. You're either for a humane and compassionate approach on the street or for making sure our public spaces are safe and accessible with some order. Right. That is a false choice on my view. Another choice that could be considered to be accurate, but it is false too, is between temporary and permanent shelter. The LA Times, for example, editorial board rails against temporary solutions in favor of permanent supportive housing on the premise that every dollar is finite. You have to put it someplace, put it to the more abiding solution, and that's permanent supportive housing. But we have an emergency on our streets right now. I was at a homeless encampment a couple weeks ago in the Brentwood area where there have been 2 homicides in 6 months. People are dying on the street right now. Our streets are less secure than they should be right now. Businesses are confronting challenges right now. We need to be taking action right now. So that implies working on permanent supportive housing and temporary shelter simultaneously, not to the exclusion of the other. So I have said, for example, I've been working with the private sector to identify ways to build cheaper and faster as we work on permanent supportive housing. That is a relatively untapped source. And as mayor, I'm going to try to galvanize the creation of at least $1 billion revolving fund with which to build permanent supportive housing. There are examples of where that approach using private equity has cut the cost in half, even as we have to have temporary locations for people to go. It is not enough to say that we're going to wait for permanent supportive housing while people languish on our streets. That is not consistent with my approach as mayor.
So tell me what your position is on safe and sanitary campsites or safe parking for those of our homeless neighbors who are living in vehicles as sort of the first step of getting the homeless off of the public right-of-ways until you can get the temporary shelters set up so that you can then have enough time to build the permanent supportive housing. Are these safe campsites and safe parking part of your plan?
Great question. They've been not only part of my plan as I'm running for mayor, they've been part of my leadership as city attorney. Years ago, maybe 6 years ago now, I can't remember for sure, I gave a memo to the city council regarding safe parking that said, why don't we do this? Why don't we create zones of the city, not in residential areas, where people who are relegated to living in their cars can be, but the ability to do that is contingent on having a placard on your dashboard that shows that you are connecting to services to lift you out of homelessness. In other words, not just a location to be in itself, show that you're making strides to connect, and we can help you connect, and then you can be in such a location. That's an approach that I think, so I am a big proponent of the safe parking locations, not because it's a perfect solution, but as you point out, it beats the hell out of sleeping on the curb.
Right, and it takes those people out of the public right of way and out of the neighborhoods and the schools and all of that sort of thing. It says, okay, here's a place where you can be, and that can be safe, it can be secure. We can offer sanitation, and we can offer services in a targeted locality, as opposed to trying to send out our social workers all over, here and there to try to round people up.
James, that is such a good point. This is a very important conversation. We could broaden it a little bit. When it comes to mental health outreach as well, it is beneficial. This is why we'll call them safe sleeping locations. Let's leave the safe parking aside, the encampment you're talking about. Even though generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of just moving an encampment to one location on a parking lot, there is an advantage in doing that in the absence of alternative locations. And one key advantage that is really under discussed is if you consolidate folks in that kind of location, you give outreach workers a much easier opportunity to connect with them, especially on mental health and substance abuse services.
Exactly. And my point is that if this was a refugee issue, like in Syria or in one of these African nations where we were dealing with a famine, the government would set up these encampments and use them as triage centers. Exactly.
Triage is the right word, by the way.
Pardon?
Triage is the right word because in some ways, I think opponents of these approaches would say these are very, very temporary measures. They're not going to solve the underlying problems. And I think we may share a common view, James, and that is, that's right. These are temporary measures. They're a bridge to something else, but they are better than the status quo. And we cannot simply wait for the perfect solution down the road, because if we do that, our city is going to be pervaded with homelessness. It's a disgrace. That's inhumane to people experiencing homeless and completely unfair to people who are housed and have businesses. And we need to be taking into account the rights of everybody here. Again, no false choices. Everybody has common interests here. Let's try to find that common ground.
Yeah, the mistake that your opponent, Mr. Buscaino, is making is that he's trying to make this a 1, 2, 3 solution with a problem that what I have called is an octagonal problem. There are at least 8 drivers of homelessness. And if you don't understand the complexity of that, then you're going to miss trying to solve the problem. And these triage centers would actually allow for the specialists, the social workers and the legal experts even, to actually come in and to sort out, the mental health problems from the addiction problems from those people that have, outstanding warrants. There's a judge over in Long Beach who's a friend of mine, who originally had set up a homeless court for homeless people. He would bring the court to, the homeless location and help them clear their warrants, because that is a real significant problem for these people.
James, our readers should know I share that precise view. So as city attorney years ago, I had my office compete to take over the county's homeless court program. Really unusual for the city to compete to take over the county program.
Right.
And we got the grant. What did that mean? We created our program called our HEART program, where we have sent teams throughout LA County to do precisely what you're talking about. We say to folks, we'll trade you. In exchange for getting rid of an outstanding fine or citation or warrant that's impeding you from getting housing or services or a job, we will get rid of those. But you have to connect with services that will benefit you. And we've conducted clinics that you would find things of beauty. I mean, picture a location where we had, hepatitis A vaccines and sexually transmitted disease vaccines. And we had fresh fruit from a farmer's market. And we had job counseling and housing and other kinds of services available, all in one location. So we do that very thing. And parenthetically, I will tell you that I was just at the homeless court in Redondo Beach 3 days ago. And one of the things that our readers should know is my office, it's in Redondo Beach, not the city of Los Angeles, had 3 staff members there doing exactly what you're talking about. So I'm completely with you. This is an all hands on deck approach. And your point is homelessness is an issue with so many facets to it. A question for our readers is, who is the candidate for mayor who gets those facets? It isn't paralyzed by the complexity, understands the complexity, has a command over it, and has a plan for each facet of it. And that's me.
Yeah, and a candidate that isn't blaming the victims and causing outrage amongst the homeowners who are afraid of crime and people living in, defecating on their streets. It's really been quite amazing to me that the anti-homeless people down here complain about the trash on the streets, but the sanitation department of the city of Los Angeles refuses to give them trash cans. I find that to be a curious approach to cleaning things up. Let's move on to another subject, though, and I appreciate your perspective on all of this. Closely related to the homeless crisis is affordable housing. And it seems as though in certain areas of the city, developers are going gangbusters. The building and safety department and zoning is waiving all kinds of community restrictions on certain things because of what shall we say, I think there's a state law that says if you're in proximity to public transit, we will lower the amount of parking mandated for an apartment project. And my feeling is that I don't think there's any time soon that the culture of Los Angeles is going to give up driving cars. But tell us about your housing plan.
I will. And actually, but James, let me just tack on a little bit more information toward the prior conversation, and just this much. You mentioned trash. You might have seen that in the last week, I, as a candidate for mayor, issued a proposal. The proposal is 1 million more hours of trash cleanup, neighborhood beautification in the city. That would mean 200 additional hours per week for every neighborhood council area of Los Angeles. And I propose this because in many ways, the city is filthy and we need to clean it up. And these are issues that are not tied necessarily to people experiencing homelessness. It's just the city has a problem with illegal dumping and trash on the street. And I mention this only because I think it's crucial that we have pride in our city again, where little kids in their neighborhoods think, someone cares about me. And one facet of that is that the city is clean and green again. So you're going to see that from me.
Yeah,
Now,
it's sort of a good neighbor kind of policy, and it sort of goes along with the Chief Bratton's broken windows concept of policing to an extent. But is there anything in this cleaning up LA program that would allow the neighborhood councils to hire the homeless to help clean up the streets?
I actually have said that I want to do outreach to people experiencing homelessness and to youth who have many barriers to get jobs, so that they be the people we focus on first for these positions. So yeah, we're on the same page.
Yeah. The mayor over in Albuquerque, I think, was handing out $10 bills to homeless people to fill a bag of trash,
Well, but and I do want to get to the affordable housing piece, but just another point on this. We need to have a cleaner city. I'm committed to that happening on my watch right away. The other thing you're mentioning, though, is in New York, there's a program not unlike what you just described, where people experiencing homelessness are given a stipend to help clean up the neighborhood. There is, among people experiencing homelessness, a core of people who are just looking for dignity and the ability to play some constructive role.
Yeah.
There are, as you know, and this is something you said earlier, there are all kinds of different people experiencing homelessness, and they have different capacities and different needs. But for those people who are capable of performing a role in making the community better, you could see people's lives getting turned around by being treated with dignity and respect.
And in our society, having a job is a position of respect.
Exactly. And look, the person with a deep substance abuse issue or serious mental health issues, that's not the person we're talking about. They have other needs right now, but they are not the only people on the street. So now let me go back to your question, because I want to be sure I answer the affordable housing question. I am a strong supporter of the program you referred to as our transit-oriented corridor program. Right. It's actually a city program that allows for the development along underutilized corridors, where there's very like 1 or 2 story buildings, but there's a lot of transit there. It allows developers to have incentives to build there as long as there is an affordable housing component there. I'm a big fan of that approach. I've already said, if you go to my website, you will see that I believe there are additional tweaks to that approach that would enable us to build more affordable housing that wouldn't require this zero-sum discussion of either having single-family neighborhoods or affordable housing. I think we could be focused on the transit-oriented corridors. We can do that. The one, James, but I would like to gently disagree with you a little bit, admittedly at my peril, but let me give it a shot.
Well, you can disagree with me without being gentle. That's okay.
So what I was going to say is, I think that there are locations where the public transit system is mature, where it makes sense to reduce parking requirements. My daughter, for example, who's 28, moved to Koreatown, doesn't want to drive. She moved there because there's a subway there. The subway stop there enabled her to get back and forth to work and to other places she needed to go. Exactly. There's a whole cadre of people younger than we are who don't want to drive. Neither am I.
But see, what you're pointing out is this: in the CD15, there is no ability for there to be a light rail line anywhere until someplace after 2035.
Yeah. No, like I say, I think that different.
They're building 300 and 400 unit apartments based upon traffic corridors that are already clogged. They're adding thousands of new units into San Pedro, in particular, that do not have enough parking. And the city is not even mandating or adhering to its own mandate of 15% low-income housing.
Yeah, and that to me,
a ride on the low-income housing, and it's a form of gentrification.
Yeah, and James, you've really hit on something that's crucially important, and that is we're building tons of housing, but very little affordable housing.
Right.
And as you know, if you talk to some, they will say, well, it's a supply and demand thing. Just creating more housing generally will at some point lead prices to drop as the supply expands. I think we need to be taking some immediate steps to complement that approach with an affordability requirement, because look, our firefighters and police officers and teachers and others who are the typical middle class resident who used to live in the city of Los Angeles can no longer afford to do that. And that has a huge impact. If our first responders live elsewhere, if our police officers live elsewhere, they have a different feeling for the community they're policing than they do if it's their neighborhood, for example. If you have people who are the core of the middle class, not in Los Angeles anymore, no society can exist that way, where it's just rich people and poor people and nothing in between. And this is not easy stuff. Anybody who says it is misleading you. But as mayor, I am riveted on this. We need to restore a middle class in Los Angeles.
And that is sort of the juncture point, because what we have done is we have, over the course of the last 40 years, lowered the expectations on what middle class is. Our teachers can't even afford to live close to the schools where they work. I have said in the past that the school district itself, probably with all of its extra property, should be building housing units on their vacant parcels.
James, I have to interrupt you for a second. I completely agree with you. And that is not just some vague idea.
Yeah.
As mayor, I want to work with the school district because, yes, school properties can be locations where we also place housing that's affordable for teachers and others right there. Exactly. And by the way, it isn't just there's a cadre of middle class residents, teachers who would benefit from that. But James, we also have an unfortunate number of families in the LA school district who experience homelessness themselves.
Exactly.
And
9%.
And how do we expect those kids to perform well if they go back to the car to do homework, right? Yeah. So I only interrupted you because you struck a resonant chord. This is one feature of my approach as mayor, is to work with the school district to have those locations used just as you suggest.
Have you looked at Ron Galprin's audit of city-owned properties that he brought up about 3 years ago that the city doesn't use? You know, and what their availability or appropriateness would be for housing?
You know, the answer is, in general, yeah. I'm cognizant of this, though. You know, some of those, first, that is, for me, we, as a city, there's no excuse not to exhaust every one of those opportunities as we seek to grapple with the issue of homelessness and affordable housing. No excuse. It is the case that some of those properties are hard to use. They're little triangles someplace, you know, they're away from utilities and so on. And I get that. But no, we should be focused on taking advantage of every one of those properties. You mentioned tiny houses. One of those properties is being used out of North Hollywood right now for a new tiny village project. Right. It had no other meaningful use, and right. It's being used for this.
Well, yeah, I mean, he came up with a list of, I think, 9,400 underutilized or vacant properties in the city of Los Angeles. And I'm going, well, you know, if they have no appropriate use, either sell them, turn them into park space, or do some, you know, or allow them to be used by developers for one reason or another. You know, I mean, the city of Los Angeles shouldn't be landlord to a bunch of vacant property. Now, that's kind of my argument down here with the Port of Los Angeles. We got into a little tiff over a parking lot recently, and I brought it to the attention of the Betty Yee at the State Lands Commission, and her response to me was, well, James, you know, right now we are reviewing what the State Tidelands Trust needs to look like for the future for the people of the state of California, and what that means in terms of public access. So the State Lands Commission, which controls the Port of Los Angeles, is reviewing an overarching policy that could allow for different types of uses of our tidelands.
That would be great. That would be great.
The port is always used as a defense mechanism when the community comes knocking on their door.
You know, I'm glad you told me about that, because I was not aware of that conversation with Betty. And it's good for me to know that, because that's a very important reevaluation.
Well, as mayor of Los Angeles, Betty is sort of in your corner in terms of community activism and good public policy. And
yep.
One of the surprise things she did when she first got on to the State Lands Commission was she held a hearing in the Port of Los Angeles's boardroom, talking about community issues. That really rang a bell for the port. Great. Yeah. Let's talk about policing and public safety policy. You have a whole page on your platform, and I must admit, your entire platform reads like it's very well thought out. So let's talk about policing and reform of policing. Sure.
So let me begin by saying this. We have a city where many neighborhoods are on edge right now. There is an increase in violent crime in some communities in the city, a huge increase in gun violence, especially in South Los Angeles, that endangers little kids every day. And at the same time, we have calls to defund the police department. Here's what I think. I do not support defunding the police department. I support increasing the department to 10,000 officers, but that is not the only investment that I think we should make in policing. We should be investing in training to assure that law enforcement de-escalates violent confrontation and uses of force. We should be expanding community partnerships when it comes to community policing, like the Community Safety Partnership in housing projects in Watts. And let me be very specific, by the way, about what I mean by that, because it's easy for our readers to have kind of an antiseptic view of this. Let me get really real about it. So Nickerson Gardens is a housing project in South LA. Nickerson Gardens has had 7 deadly shootings this year to date. I have been focused on preventing gun violence throughout my career as a public servant. I'm not just a leader here, but nationally on this issue. And I've been struggling with a particular facet of public safety. And if you just indulge me for a second, I'd like to mention something to you that goes a little bit beyond your question, but it's relevant to me. One of the least discussed issues when it comes to kids in our society, especially kids in tough neighborhoods, is the impact of trauma on them for the rest of their lives.
Oh, yeah.
When I was a city council member back in the 1990s, I worked to assure that trained therapists would roll out with LAPD to domestic violence scenes, because the brain science then was a kid who witnesses or is a victim of violence is likely to perpetrate it later on in their lives. But that's the old science. Still true, but that doesn't begin to touch the issue. The more recent science is if a child is exposed to trauma, gun violence, gang violence on any kind of an ongoing basis, that kid is never going to have their brain develop the way it was biologically destined to, ever. And we think about who are those kids? Those kids are the same kids who typically have the least access to good education. Their parents don't have good jobs. Healthcare is harder to find. Good food is hard to find. Recreation is fewer. Think about that, what we've done to a huge cohort of our children. And these are our kids. So with that revelation in mind, as city attorney, I wanted to do something about that here. So I looked for the area of Los Angeles with the most shots fired calls, because the mere awareness that a shot was fired causes trauma for kids. It happens to be in Watts. We created a program where now we send LAPD, a trained therapist from the Children's Institute, and a community activist to the scene of every shooting, looking for kids who might even be aware the shot was fired, immediately offering therapy to them to try to deflect the otherwise terrible impact on their brain's development. And then we train teachers and parents and administrators what the signs of trauma are so we can intervene with them right away.
And so you are actually arguing for a key element of the defunding police model, as in when I talked to the captain of Harbor Division, I said, Captain Mastic, what part of policing the homeless would you give up if you could put those resources into combating violent crime? And his answer to that was, I thought, I'd give it all if there was somebody to give it to, right?
Yep.
And
yep.
The same thing is true for policing, the mentally ill. And you're talking really about having a strike force, not only of police responding to a violent crime, but backing it up with social services, which means you're going to have county mental health involved in all of this, and it becomes a very complex solution. I'm not saying that it couldn't be done, but complexity usually is the enemy of accomplishment in these here city of Los Angeles.
But James, for what it's worth, we created this program. I didn't get more public money to do it. We've gotten grants to do this, LAPD, and we have expanded this. The Children's Institute has been great. And what I was going to say about that program as it relates to policing is this. There was a shooting a few months ago in Nickerson Gardens, and I don't want to sanitize this for our readers. I'm talking about someone's dad lying face down on the playground with the child trying to shake the parent awake, saying, "Daddy, Daddy, please wake up." That is what was happening. So a couple days later, it happened on a weekend, this team I'm describing was at Nickerson Gardens providing intervention and therapy for the kids there.
Right.
And there was a shooting so close to the team that LAPD had to come in and evacuate them, and they were traumatized. So I went to Nickerson Gardens the next day, not with TV cameras and stuff. I just wanted those kids to know an adult cares about them. And when it comes to policing, and this is the point I want to make, here is what I saw. I saw police officers who are embedded in Nickerson Gardens pursuant to the Community Safety Partnership. They have 5-year stints there. I saw the gentle and very touching relationship between the kids and those police officers. I saw an LAPD official lead a prayer circle of members of the community on that playground that day. So when I hear defund the police advocates, one of whom says, we don't need social workers with guns, I beg to differ. I want police officers like I saw that day who earned the trust and respect of the community they serve. Exactly. And yeah, by the way, they need guns because it's dangerous down there, right?
And I would prefer to have a police officer who has a Bachelor of Science in social work than 4 years of experience fighting in Fallujah.
Yes.
And so how do you deal with that in terms of hiring practices and all of that kind of thing? The problem that we have really is that, and I know many very excellent police officers who have worked the streets of San Pedro. You know, San Pedro is kind of a lot different than the rest of the divisions in LAPD. The Harbor Division is sort of like its own police department.
Right, right.
And so it's unique in that respect. So the people here get to know the officers pretty well. And when there is an officer that has got a bad attitude, we know that too. And the problem is it's hard to get rid of officers with a bad attitude if you don't have the captain on your side, and if you don't have the city council person on your side. It ends up being a lawsuit that the city of Los Angeles ends up having to pay out of the general fund because the city is self-insured. Now, you know better than anybody else who's running for this office how many legal settlements the city has had to pay because of bad police conduct. How do you deal with that?
You know, James, I can kind of say, by the way, this is among the most probing and interesting interviews I've done in a long time. Thank you for that. And on the points you've raised actually not one, but two different issues. One issue you've raised is, how do we get the police force we want in the first place? And I will say that Chief Moore has been advocating something I strongly believe in, and that is, how do we get more police officers with college degrees into the force? Yeah, your point is exactly right. And his point, it's the same point, basically. You're getting people who are more sophisticated, more sensitive, more knowledgeable, more ready to be that full police officer who's really a community partner and a guardian of the people they're serving than otherwise. So I'm
as opposed to being looked at as an occupying military force suppressing the violence.
Exactly. So I'm right with you on that, and I strongly support that effort. The other thing you've asked about is, how do we deal with officers who aren't doing the job properly? And I have a few thoughts about that. First, on a grand scale, you might have seen just a day or two ago, the governor signed Senator Bradford's bill to make it no longer possible for a police officer who has been severely disciplined in a use of force case to easily go from one department to another. That's a good move in general. I support that approach. Within LAPD, I think this is a matter of raw management. It is a matter of training supervisors to effectively identify who should be in public-facing roles and who should not be. Because yes, you are right. My office is kind of the soccer goalie for the team. Right. When something goes wrong, we have to defend the net after it's gone wrong. And one thing you should know, and our readers should know, is as city attorney, I took a step that others had not before me done. I created a leader on risk management in the city. And another way to put that is someone in my office who is in charge of finding ways to prevent problems in the first place, so we're not having to defend expensive lawsuits later on. And one aspect of that work, kind of related to your question, is you have seen a decrease in police employment lawsuits relating to officers who feel they've been retaliated against and so forth, because of teamwork to train supervisors to avoid being in situations that would give rise to litigation. Use of force issues are more complicated to deal with, and I support de-escalation training in a big way. There's a lot the city can do to create a culture in the department, but that's what we want. Right now, James, the balance is, how do we do the training and investment I'm talking about to create the force that we want at LAPD, while at the same time being supportive of police work when folks are trying to do their best on the force? Because right now, the LAPD feels unsupported by the community and by political leaders. And that is causing huge morale issues. So as mayor of the city, I think it is possible to convey both things. It's possible to convey the need for police reform. For example, on the city council 20 years ago, I was responsible for putting into a consent decree, the federal government, an approach to diminish what's called racial profiling. You know, stops on the street based on the color of the skin of the people who are being stopped. I wanted to put a stop to that myself on the city council. But I also told the city council in a very emotional debate about a town hall meeting I was present at where the police were under a lot of scrutiny. And one of my constituents rose to say, I'm actually here to support the police because my son in high school was returning from a football game, stopped at a 7-Eleven, and was shot in a drive-by shooting. And I'm supporting police today because an officer came to the scene. My son was not going to survive. The officer made sure that he held my son so he wouldn't die by himself. And I think we need to be able, as leaders, to identify the areas where reform is appropriate and the moments to stand up for our law enforcement officers when they're doing the right thing. And I think that we don't have enough of that balance today.
Well, there's two thoughts that I have there. One is that if you mandated vaccinations for all of the police officers who are resistant to getting vaccinated, you would probably get rid of a lot of problem officers from the force right now. The other thing is that we need to move the culture. This is the hardest part about dealing with policing. We need to move the culture away from a militarized model of policing. It's great that you have the SWAT teams for backup. It's great that we have, all of the tech that we get from the United States military, but it should not be the first thing that comes out whenever there is something happening. I mean, the idea of the police helicopters, I think, is actually kind of old technology. They could be doing the whole thing with drones if they wanted to, but the people just feel as though in my neighborhood and other neighborhoods, they want to be able to call the police when there's something going on, but there's a hesitancy to call them. And
yeah.
There needs to be that sense of real community-based policing that is not going to end up shooting the wrong person when they arrive.
Yeah, and this is one reason I favor that community safety partnership model, and I favor having officers have longer rotations in neighborhoods, so that, as you described, we know a San Pedrin recognizes Officer X because they've known that officer for a couple of years now. They understand that officer. The officer knows what's going on in that community. And that's the model that works the best.
Yeah. What do you think about the concept of actually having community police review boards that would be elected from neighborhood councils instead of these? Each division sort of has a what do they call it? A CPAB.
The CPABs. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And my criticism to Captain Mastic down here is, you get a lot of ass kissers, people that like to, be around people in uniform and whatnot. And what he really needs is somebody who's going to tell him the bad news of what's going on in the community.
Yeah. And so for what it's worth, I've worked with CPABs over the years. I haven't thought about that. Let me think about that a little bit, because I as you know, on the city council, I actually created neighborhood councils in my district before the charter required them. And then I was the person who initiated charter reform that created neighborhood councils back in 1997 and 1999. So I'm a supporter of that community level of engagement. Let me think about whether electing or appointing makes the most sense for essentially what is a community. The CPAB is supposed to be more than a police support group. It's also right. And so let me think about that. That's an interesting idea.
Well, you see, the thing is that the neighborhood councils are supposed to do what I'm about ready to ask you about next, which is to bring, democracy closer to the people. And it started off with a whole lot of that intention. But if you look at the org chart for the city, neighborhood councils, even though they're elected by people, by constituents, are based way down the org chart underneath another department, and the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment and all that thinks that it's their job to keep a harness on neighborhood councils, rather than the neighborhood councils being above the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment and getting support from the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. And then the city attorneys that are given to the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment sort of are used to protect the city from any liabilities created by the neighborhood councils, as opposed to advising them legalistically on how to run democracies better.
Well, actually, James, so a few thoughts. First, on that point, I actually have 3 terrific members of my staff who are assigned to perform that advisory role you described. And I should tell you, because I see the requests that come in, they are often asked for, how do we facilitate this discussion better in a way that is consistent with the law. And so we do provide that kind of advisory role. But I want to use, because I only have like 3 minutes left, and I know we have to tell this. Can I use this moment to talk about my proposal for cutting city council districts in half?
There we go. Because therein is the discussion of what the value of neighborhood councils are to the city and how you're going to actually bring democracy closer to the people.
Yes. So as a former city council member, I propose that we cut city council districts in half. Our city council districts are gigantic. There are major cities in the United States that are smaller than our city council districts, which have about 260,000 people in them. And so what I would do as mayor is to pursue a charter amendment to say, let's cut the districts in half, bring them down to about 130,000 people or so. And let me be very specific to San Pedro. If we did that, a district comprised of San Pedro, Wilmington, and Harbor City would be, roughly speaking, the size of the council district. If you take those three communities together right now, they comprise about 140,000 people. And that's, 130,000, about half. So that gives you a sense of the kind of local control and engagement you would get under my proposal. As it stands now, I know, because I remember the secession movement, San Pedrans were very interested in breaking away from the city of Los Angeles. If there was a city council district comprised, as I just described, and people felt they had a voice that was singularly focused on the community, people would feel much better about city government. Now, the other thing about having smaller council districts is you have council members who then are much more intimately familiar with the issues on the street. They are much more easily held accountable, because now with districts the size that they are, it's easy for a council member to say, well, they don't like me over here, but I have the rest of this district they'll support me in this. I want the smaller districts for closer, more responsive government. And I've also proposed that along with that cut in the size of the district, that we cut the council salaries commensurate to that. That is not to be punitive to council members. It's to recognize that when the charter reform happened in the 1990s, 25 council members lost on the ballot, with opponents of that saying it's going to cost too much. So I want to make this proposal of mine as close to cost neutral as we can. And so that's my approach. I think it's a good one. It is utterly consistent with maintaining neighborhood councils. As I said earlier, my proposal to clean up the streets of the city thinks of the neighborhood councils as the regions that would get 200 additional hours every week of cleanup. So I believe in people. I believe that the city would benefit from more deep engagement and closer relations between government and the people it serves. And that's where I stand.
So one last question about the shifting of the council. Wouldn't you need to have an odd number of council seats for it to work, just politically speaking?
Oh, to get a majority, you could, but you could also say there'd be 30 council members and have a tiebreaker of some kind if you need to.
One of the council people would be the president of the council, who would then be a non-voting position unless there was a tie of some kind.
But you could also, yes, so you either have an odd number, and again, there's nothing, you could easily make 29 or 31 council districts, or you could say in the event of a tie vote, the mayor could break the tie. There are ways to grapple with that issue.
Yes, that would be one way of doing it.
Yeah, the U.S. Senate breaks ties that way, as we famously know, with Kamala Harris performing that role.
Yes, and we do miss her out here.
Indeed.
When I saw her at the Labor Day picnic several years ago, and she was running for Senate, I looked at her and I said, I think that this woman is probably the most, the smartest, the most beautiful, and most dangerous woman in American politics today. And I think she's proven me correct in that assessment of her. And I just hope that she's able to actually do for Mr. Biden the bidding that needs to be done in the Senate and get some things done. Again, thank you, Mike Feuer, candidate for mayor of Los Angeles, currently the city attorney for Los Angeles. And I wish you good luck. Oh, one last thing. I was going to lead off with this. 2 weeks ago, this campaign was about you and Joe Buscaino. And in the last 2 weeks, the politics of this race got a lot more complicated. You want to have a last word on that perspective?
Yeah, just very quickly. I then and now am the only candidate for mayor who has run successfully citywide twice. I beat the incumbent city attorney, and then I did a good enough job that no one ran against me for re-election. So voters throughout Los Angeles are familiar with me and have been supporting me. I'm going to be running for mayor the same way I have governed as city attorney, to be everyone's mayor. And in a race that has gotten more crowded, very much what I expected. I never expected a couple person race. I thought it would be just like the way it looks right now. In this race, I'm going to be going everywhere in the city without preempting for future announcements. James, you're going to see me all over the place, interacting with people. This is going to be a people-oriented campaign focused on the fact that our city is in crisis and we need to have a future we can all believe in. So I'm actually welcoming the number of candidates who are in the race now. It's the group who I expected more or less would be involved from the get-go. And it's time that the game is on. As one of my supporters sent me an email, game on.
And you're inviting them to have a ongoing set of debates. I would be more than happy to work with your team on doing a one or more virtual debates with Random Lengths News. And when you are coming to the harbor area, give me a little heads up. I would like to have you do a sit down with Supervisor Janice Hahn, who is a fan of our newspaper.
Indeed. Let's do it. James, great talking to you. Thanks very much for the conversation.
Great.
Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Who knows who's gonna save our city? Who knows who, hey, could be the one? Everybody's got the lowdown on your town.